This show does not provide medical advice. If you're having a medical emergency, please call 911. Anything you hear here should be discussed with your primary health care provider. Hello, and welcome to Everyone Dies, the radio show produced by Passionate World Talk Radio, whose goal it is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. I'm Marianne Matzo, and for the next 30 minutes, I am your host. This week, we're going to be talking about clinical trials. Now, a clinical trial, and in fact, we are dropping a podcast on our webpage, everyonedies.org. It's EDERY, the number 1, dies.org. So you can listen to all of the background about what is a clinical trial and what are the phases of a clinical trial. But today in our interview, I have the privilege, and I'm very excited to be interviewing Deborah Wright, who's an advanced practice registered nurse, a clinical nurse specialist, and works in the Phase 1 program and clinical trial office at the Stephenson Cancer Center. I had the privilege of working with Deborah for many years while I was there, and she is a top-notch clinician, and she spent 13 years as a registered nurse caring for people on clinical trials, and in particular those with gynecological cancers. She went back to school and became an advanced practice registered nurse, and now she's caring for patients with any type of cancer who are involved in Phase 1 studies. So, Deb, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Thank you. So, what is a Phase 1 study?
Well, a Phase 1 study is the first initial part of a clinical trial that uses a new medication, and I'm going to refer to it as a medication that is used for a cancer patient because that's where my background lies. But you can really apply the steps to any medication, whether it's a vaccine, a new medicine for asthma, or for a new medicine for congestive heart failure. So once the drug has been developed and it's been tested in laboratories, and often, yes, it's been tested in animals, and that's not something we all like to talk about, but it's something that has to happen. It goes into human research. And Phase 1 often starts off with what we call first-in-human trials, and I have been a caregiver for patients with first-in-human. First-in-human literally means it is the first time that medication has been administered to a human being. And so often we do not know the types of side effects. Often we don't even have the effective dosing. We start at the lowest dose, and we treat a small population of patients at a time. We call those cohorts. Cohorts just simply means groups. And oftentimes we start at 3 at a time, and that necessarily is not going to be 3 patients at my cancer center, but we're talking nationwide at all participating sites or cancer centers who are participating in the trial or who are running the program. Once those patients are treated and we observe those side effects, oftentimes the trial is closed temporarily for a short amount of time. We discuss next steps, and then we do an escalation, or we go up on the dose. Escalation simply means increasing of the dose. That's what Phase 1 is. Phase 1 trials are not necessarily meant to look at what the drug does to the cancer. It is simply learning what the drug does, how it affects the patient, and hopefully we find out that it does help either decrease or stabilize the patient's cancer. But it's mostly meant to just look at the drug itself. That's what a Phase 1 trial is.
So in those first-in-human studies, have you ever seen really serious adverse events where you're like, holy moly, we've got to stop this now?
I've seen medications like that. Oftentimes when you are on a Phase 1 trial, and this really rings true for all clinical trial patients, but the acuity or the level of complexity for Phase 1 trials is really at the utmost or the highest that you can get. And patients who choose to participate on these trials, they are seen very often. Their frequency of provider visits can be weekly. Sometimes in first in humans, it's daily for maybe the first 14 days that we treat the patient. And they're not continuously treating necessarily on this medication unless it's an oral medication, which we have quite a few of those now. Mm-hmm. But we are there to notice anything that changes from what their baseline symptoms, and that is symptoms of their other chronic illnesses or diseases like diabetes or high blood pressure, and of course their symptoms of their cancer, whether it be pain, constipation, trouble with appetite, neuropathy, which is numbing, tingling in hands and feet, and we see that after patients get chemo. But we are there to see what changes happen. And then when there is a severe change and there is a compromise to that patient's status that involves especially a hospitalization or a life-threatening event, that is reported within 24 hours to the FDA and to the study. And oftentimes there are phone calls that happen within hours that we are sharing as much information as we can. And all of the patient's identification is protected. We are only speaking of the patient in the form of a clinical trial number that's assigned to patients. And that doesn't dehumanize the situation at all. It just protects the patient's privacy. And that's what we try to do. And then there's decisions, and sometimes trials are halted and they're stopped while we analyze the situation, whether the patient survives the event or they don't survive the event. It has to be discussed, and there are oftentimes exchanges of blood samples and different things that can help us determine what was the cause of the event. Was it related to something the patient already was experiencing and some other medical condition, or was this directly attributed to the drug? And sometimes the question is never fully answered, and oftentimes trials will end because we really never can know for sure, and it's just not safe to go forward.
So sometimes I hear patients, will say when they talk about being in a clinical trial that they're just a human guinea pig. Do you think that's true?
I hear that often, and I've heard that of all of the years that I've ever been part of research, whether I was part of the later phase of research where drugs that are compared to regular drugs, patients will say, well, I just feel like a guinea pig. And what my take-home message with them is they are doing us a huge honor by agreeing to consent to a clinical trial, and we are going to try to make their experience as easy as possible by arranging, I try to make sure that we involve multidisciplinary care, that we have extra nursing available to arrange all of their schedules, and that there is, I don't want them to feel like they're on a conveyor belt, that I'm just giving them medications, taking temperatures and vital signs, and then moving them down the conveyor belt. That is not something that should be ever the approach to clinical trial. It is, when you walk in a patient's shoes, it is easy to see how a patient would feel that way. But these are often patients, then I have to remind these patients that they have either exhausted or their standard of care, which means they have had all of the chemotherapies that are currently FDA approved for their cancer that could offer it benefit, and they are not ready to move on to palliative care or hospice care at home. They're not ready to make that step yet, though it's been extensively explained to them what all that means, because I believe that that's also still a form of continuing cancer care, that they are here to talk about a drug that could potentially benefit them. It could potentially help them, and it could potentially help people and patients in the future, and that's often, or family members in the future, especially if a patient might have like a BRCA mutation, breast or ovarian cancer, or as we know, urothelial and pancreatic patients, we know have these, this BRCA or BRCA gene. They're very, very passionate about, I want to help people in the future. Well, usually that guinea pig comparison fades away in the background as we really talk one-on-one, because I believe that patients need to have all of the knowledge of what the clinical trial is and what is going to be expected of them. That way they've made the most informed decision, and I put some of that power back in their hands. You don't want them to feel powerless. You don't want them to have that complete loss of control.
So is a clinical trial only when there are no other options for somebody?
Not necessarily. Oftentimes a patient, that is one scenario. There's multiple scenarios now for clinical trials. Patients come to me for clinical trials now that have just been diagnosed, and that they will be getting the standard of care regimen, which I call the gold standard or the backbone of what we know is the best approved regimen. And then we like to introduce a new drug that might potentiate or make the standard of care work better. That's not definitely a last resort sort of scenario. I also have patients that have exhausted a lot, several of their regimens, and maybe they didn't tolerate it very well. Maybe IV chemotherapies was something that was very hard on their system, and they have a lot of bone marrow and blood count issues. And maybe I have an immunotherapy, or maybe I have a targeted oral drug that they are interested in. And if the standard of care is not the right choice for them, then the patient can have that option to say, I don't want the standard of care, I want to try the trial next. Then they might have standard of care options for themselves down the road. So there's many different ways to enter a clinical trial now rather than just exhausting all standard of care, which used to be pretty much the norm for phase 1, but that's really changed over the last, I'd say, 5 to 8 years.
So can only patients with advanced cancer join a clinical trial?
The majority of my patients have some sort of advanced cancer that could not be cured by surgery. I do have several trials right now currently for ovarian cancer. These patients they will be getting surgery and the standard chemotherapy, but we're giving them other what we call investigator-initiated trials, which these are homegrown trials that are written and are run strictly at my cancer center, at Stephenson Cancer Center. They are advanced because, that's not really a great example, because most ovarian cancer patients, when they come in, because it's such a silent disease, that they are often already advanced. But I would, right now, currently in my phase 1 program and what I have seen, my patients are either advanced or they are metastatic, which means the cancer has spread beyond the primary site, or they have had a reoccurrence of advanced disease. So I would say the majority of my patients are all advanced cancer. So I have to go back and think about that sometimes.
Well, sometimes it's good to talk about it because it kind of focuses us on what it is, the work that we're doing. Even though we do it, 10 hours a day, it's still like you said, in the last 5 years, a lot has changed. When we would talk about phase 1 trials, in the old days, it was not, it was people who were, sort of at the end of their life, and really just the focus being a contribution to science, right?
Right, exactly.
So, we hear a lot in the news about the trials for the COVID-19 vaccine. And, I read and I hear about people saying, well, what takes so long? And why can't we just, start giving it to people? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. And there are several, and I was part of the phase 3. I was so just starting out in clinical research. Actually, I was at OU getting my registered nurse when I was working on my bachelor's. In fact, I had you for a class. I had you for nursing research. I was part of the Gardasil. I helped follow patients in the part of the phase 3 for Gardasil. I mean, Gardasil took, it took 10, 15 years for that vaccine, and it's going to be a game changer for cervix cancer and for head and neck cancers and for anal cancers. I mean, it's going to be a game changer. It takes time to develop a vaccine. Why I would like for us to have a vaccine as part of just a person that would like to get back and to travel again and do all of the things that we all love. I do worry that the fast track that some of these vaccine trials are having might, number one, they might not be effective vaccines. Number two, they might have immunological types of side effects that could hurt people and could cause, some serious effects that could be life-threatening. And I do worry that it's being fast-tracked. And there's a lot of the cancer drugs that we have seen, the new immunological therapies, what we call PD-1s or PD-L1s. Patients see these all the time, these beautiful ads on television, these drugs called Opdivo or Keytruda. These drugs were fast-tracked in some ways. They weren't fast-tracked in a year. They were fast-tracked over a period of several years, but not the decade or 15 years because, the phase, but they still followed the phases of research. So they initialized in phase 1, and then they went on in phase 2. There are some of our drugs that are not going on to phase 3. Phase 3 is where you compare oftentimes a drug with the standard of care. Sometimes it does involve a kind of a double-blind placebo-controlled. And that's always a question with cancer patients. It always has to have another therapy combined with that. You don't ever want to give a patient just a placebo. That's not ethical. I have some concerns about it. I follow the news on the vaccine as much as I can. I know there's a couple of companies here in the United States with a lot of, it's getting very wrapped up into politics, which I have a hard time filtering through sometimes myself. So I do have concerns about safety in the vaccine. I want us to have an effective vaccine, but I do think that this will be a vaccine that's going to be an ever-evolving vaccine because I believe this virus will continue to mutate just like the flu does.
Right, and I think that's something important for the listeners to understand is that, even cancer can mutate, right? Even cancer,
exactly.
We have a drug that we say, okay, this is our gold standard. This works great for this type of cancer. And excuse me. And then the cancer itself can change. And then the drugs that we're using are not as efficacious in their treatment. And it's important to understand that these viruses or even the cancer itself, these are living things. They grow, they change, they develop. And viruses like the flu or COVID-19 or SARS, they rapidly change also. And so, which is why the flu vaccine, if you think about it, it's sort of every fall they're doing actually a best guess of what is the flu that's going to affect people and putting that into the vaccine. And their best guess is sometimes good and sometimes not, right?
Exactly.
So,
I mean, it's a lot of times it's based on data that's 2 years old.
Right.
So it's based on the mutation and the genetic line of that virus that's 24 months out, in the past, and it's changed, it mutates, exactly. I just think that this virus, and I think that, the virus that hit Seattle wasn't necessarily the same virus that hit Italy that they believe is the virus that hit New York. It's because of how human beings travel and how we spread disease to one another. And in that, with climate and then with our own bodies, these viruses have that wonderful breeding ground to make those changes because they are out for the virus is out to survive. That's its goal.
And the cancer is the same way. The cancer uses the body as a host and says, I'm going to take this over. Sometimes we have drugs that can stop it in its tracks. Sometimes we have drugs that can slow it down. And sometimes we don't have anything. And I often hear from my patients that, why can't you? Why can't you cure cancer? Why can't you stop this virus? And people don't necessarily understand that it's a moving target, that you're shooting at something and then the target changes and whatever you were using to shoot it with, it just doesn't work anymore. Have you noticed, or have you in your studies, when I was working at the university, I sat on the institutional review board that reviewed all research studies, and I did that for 10 years. And one of the things that we would often see in consents for people were, like, for women, while you're on this drug, you cannot get pregnant. You must use a form of birth control. Or for men, while you're on this drug, your partner must be on some form of birth control. Do you see genetic changes in offspring of people who take certain drugs?
That is a great question. And that is one of the most, and it can be an overlooked part of the inclusion criteria. There's a set of rules that all patients have to meet. All of the inclusions have to be a yes, and the patient has to agree to all of this or not have any issues, and the exclusion means they cannot meet any of these, not a safe option for this patient. There's always an inclusion criteria for women of childbearing potential. That's a term that we use quite frequently in research world, women of childbearing potential. And then if they have a partner, it can get very, very interesting. Now, in my sense, yes. I believe that it could have some birth defect issues if a patient should get pregnant while on an investigational agent. I have been aware of this situation many years ago, happening maybe one or two times. I don't recall the outcome. I don't believe that there was I don't believe that the pregnancy went to term. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that as far as a teratogen, it's going to cause, these drugs could potentially cause, anomalies in the fetus that would be detrimental and potentially, affect the, and how can you say? I mean, that's just a horrendous thought. It's very worrisome, and so that is something that we have to do that tick box, and I often prescribe if I know of a patient that is still ovulating and she has a chance of becoming pregnant, and she also has stage 4 cancer of some sort, like colon cancer, which, believe it or not, I have a lot of women. There seems to be more. I'm seeing, it's very disturbing to me, I'm seeing 20 and 30 and 40-year-olds present with late-stage colon cancer, and we aren't sure why that's happening right now. We have some ideas, but nothing's been proven out. It's very important that we make sure.
That used to be a disease of, like, middle-aged men, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm seeing a lot more of it, and this is a conversation that we have to have with people. And even if they're not, and they say, well, I'm not sexually active right now, I still have to put you on some sort of birth control, whether it be, sometimes we go back to old school and we still use Depo-Provera, or we use, oral contraception. Oftentimes, and if they barrier methods are acceptable, but they have to use spermicide and condom as well. Mm-hmm. And they have to agree. And in every cycle, if there's a woman of childbearing potential, especially seems to be the focus more on the female, of course, in these types of situations. They get a pregnancy test every time they come in before they treat. We either do one by urine or by blood. It's odd enough, and I will say this, for my men who have a spouse that we counsel them on contraception, I'm not testing the wife every month, if that makes sense, but we're not doing that. She's not the trial participant. But I could see a person listening to this podcast saying, well, what about testing the spouse? Right. And, if they're in a heterosexual, if this is, a couple. And, I've had couples that are same-sex couples. I've had lesbian couples, and then they're like, why do you continuously tell me I have to be on birth control? I'm not going to be getting pregnant. Why do I have to take this extra medication? It can be a tricky thing. I've actually advocated for patients and said this patient is not at risk of becoming pregnant. Therefore, we're not going to put her on this extra medication. So,
and is that allowed? Because I know there's a lot of rules with these studies. It's like we don't care what the details are.
I usually ask before I commit. I usually say, this is my situation. And then what we do is we enter in a statement, a provider statement, and the statement has to follow this patient in every clinic note. And then we notify the study, and the study will either say, yes, we understand that there are different situations, and then they'll say, no, we want you to follow it. But sometimes we can't get permission. They do understand that not every patient is going to meet this black and white rule. There's always there's difference. Patients come from are different. Patients are different. Their lifestyles are different.
Right. And I've heard comments made, when you talk about politicizing things, like, well, what, go ahead and take it. What's the worst thing that could happen? And so, Deb, what are the worst things that could happen if somebody takes, I know that this drug is approved for X, but I have Y, and I read on Facebook that it might help me. So what's the worst thing that could happen? Do you have any thoughts about that?
The worst thing that can happen if you have an advanced cancer and you take something for another disease process, it's probably not going to help your cancer at all. And then your cancer is going to continue to grow and progress until you become so symptomatic that it affects your quality of life and your ability to take care of yourself. Or it could interact with other medications that you're on and potentiate another issue that you might have, whether you have, high blood pressure or heart disease, or you have diabetes, or it can cause side effects that could potentially cause you to end up in the hospital very, very sick or end your life. That's what could happen. And I see that a lot with over-the-counter preparations. We had a situation here in the state of Oklahoma where several of my patients were taking dog dewormer because they read on
I remember
social
when
media.
Patients were talking about that. What happened?
Well, I would not allow any of my patients to be on dog dewormer and be on a clinical trial. So they would at least have to verbally agree. Now, I have no way of going to their home and checking their medicine cabinet or doing a blood test to see if they weren't taking it. But we explained to them that it would be potentially to their detriment if they would take something that I knew nothing about, that had not been studied, and I knew nothing about how it reacts within a human body. I mean, it's a toxin. It's meant to kill a parasite in the gut of a dog or some other animal. How it would interact with what we were giving them. I didn't want to do anything that could potentially make them so ill that they end up in the hospital with kidney failure or some other bleeding issue. So we have to have patients. We basically have patients, and we go through everything that they put in their mouth to make sure that it might not have an interaction concern. And sometimes we don't always know if it will or not. Sometimes we err on the side of some people might consider overcaution, because we say there's some supplements and vitamins that some people might want to take every day, or some herbs. And sometimes I have to say, you really need, we can't do that. We can't do that right now. One of the things that they have seemed to overcome a lot of the clinical trials is allowing medical marijuana, which is something that was not allowed for a while, but that's becoming much more allowed. That doesn't seem to be an issue now. And I haven't seen any side effects with it at all. I haven't seen any interactions that would be concerning.
I know my sister was diagnosed with uterine cancer. God, it's almost, 15, 20 years ago. I was stunned by how many emails and things that she would get about these alternative cures. And they were not cheap. And she would buy some of them. And she'd say, I want to talk to you about this, whatever it was. And I'd say, okay, if you want to. And she says, I can just tell by the tone of your voice that you don't think it's going to do any good. And I said, Joan, if you think it's going to do good, and, and she wasn't on any trials, but, she was on taking chemo, then you make your own best decision. But she would spend hundreds of dollars on some of these things. And it just seems like there's a lot of people out there who are willing to take advantage of people in sort of a desperate situation.
Oh, I have patients that ship in medications over the years when they were on trials that maybe didn't have such a strict criteria on what they were taking. We call that, it's another one of those research terms, concomitant medications. That just literally means whatever you're taking, vitamin-wise, supplement-wise, medication-wise, at the same time that you're on a trial. Whatever you're taking, as part of your regular, usual care. They would have, I've had patients travel overseas. I had a patient travel to Brazil. I've had a patient ship in medications from Denmark and from Europe and from India. And I didn't know what was in these medications. Sometimes they would have an ingredients list, and it was oftentimes just different mixes of herbals and different things. But they would spend hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars for these, for these supplements or for these other treatments that they really wanted to try, because I think that patients want to not ever feel that they didn't leave a stone unturned, that I want to try every option out there for me. And if a patient needs to be able to do this for themselves, for their peace of mind, I can't sit there and say don't do this, but it does hurt me to see patients who are already facing financial toxicity because of cancer treatments, doctor visits, paying surgeries, paying for CAT scans, paying for this, paying for that, not being able to work as much because they don't feel well because they're on chemo, mm-hmm. and then they're laying out all of this money for this stuff that I don't know if it's going to help them. And I don't know if maybe helping their peace of mind is worth it for them, and maybe it's worth it for them. I do find that patients like to have that. They feel very empowered to be able to make those decisions for themselves. And if that comforts them in some way and it's not going to hurt them, or if I don't know if it's going to hurt them and if it's allowed, then, patients go on and do that. When patients opt to do those treatments in lieu of any sort of standard of care, I really spend a lot of time counseling them on what their risk could be, because this, they could be potentially, I've had patients come to my phase 1 program who decided to do naturopathic treatment, mm-hmm. and it didn't work, and they came in and they never were able to get a good response to chemotherapy. Like, we lost time, but that was just my own observation.
Yeah, I've had patients like that in supportive care where the standard of care was offered to them, and they either, did homeopathic or put their trust in a higher power to be cured, and then, some time goes by and that's not what the outcome they had. And and it's hard as a clinician, isn't it, to try to help them at that point when it really is too late.
It is. Mm-hmm.
I really, really appreciate you talking with us today, because I think that our listeners need to hear about what clinical trials are, both for people with cancer who, there's constantly work being done to find something that is, depending on the type of cancer, that can either stop it or slow it, but also for lots of other drugs. And your experience has been phenomenal, and I know the care that you give your patients is high quality and very caring, and Stephenson Cancer Center is very lucky to have you there. So thank you for spending time and talking with me today. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I just would hope that anyone that is interested in a clinical trial, if you're going through a cancer diagnosis, to read all you can online, but go to knowledgeable sites such as clinicaltrials.gov to talk to your clinician. For people that are listening to the podcast that are just wondering how drugs are developed, there's interesting articles, and the National Institute of Health explains what clinical trials are. And if people out there that are stressed and hoping and wishing and praying for these vaccines, and hear all the stuff that is going on in social media and in the news, that you reach out and look for good, reliable sources that can explain the science behind how we develop drugs and vaccines, and that it has to be done in a specific way, and never stop asking questions, and question everything and empower yourselves to get the information that you need. And I can talk about clinical trials all day long. I'm very passionate about clinical trials, or I wouldn't be doing it. You either love working in them or you don't. I apparently do, because I've been doing it for so long. But I do appreciate you having me on, and it's been lovely talking. I don't get to see you anymore, so it's been lovely talking to you.
And I want our listeners to know that, go listen to the podcast about clinical trials. You can find it at everyonedies.org. It's EVERY, the number 1, dies.org, and that is good evidence-based information. And there's a lot of links and resources that are also with that podcast. So I want to thank you for spending time with me during our show, Everyone Dies. You can read our blogs and listen to our thank you. Our listeners can read our blogs and listen to our other podcasts at everyonedies.org. It's EVERY, the number 1, DIES.org. Thank you to our producer, Jeanne White, and our CEO, Lillian Caldwell. We produce a new show every Wednesday to answer questions related to life-threatening illness, dying, and death. Remember, you can listen to Passionate World Talk Radio on Spreaker and our shows wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a topic that you'd like to discuss on our show, please email Marianne at everyonedies.org. It's MARIANNE at everyonedies.org. I hope that you live your best life every day. And remember, every day is a gift. Thank you for listening.